Have you ever stopped to think how a simple piece of paper can carry more tension than a lifetime of living together? What if I told you that a missing will has the power to reveal resentments, break bonds, and expose the most vulnerable and dark side of an entire family? It seems exaggerated, right? But what if it were you? This story isn't just about money. It's about identity, about unresolved pasts, about the silences that scream within a home where love once existed. Here, 3 siblings discover that what their father left behind wasn't just possessions, but secrets, difficult decisions, and an emotional legacy none of them were prepared to carry. The lost will isn't just a document. It's the spark that ignites forgotten hurts, uncomfortable truths, and the fear of not being truly loved. But the most disturbing thing? The contents of this will aren't what you expect, and its impact goes far beyond what any lawyer could have predicted. Prepare yourself for a story of betrayal, truth, reconciliation, and choice. Because when everything falls apart, only one question remains: will you keep fighting for what's already past, or fight to save what can still be rebuilt? It was a morning of leaden skies and a whispering wind in the Vermont hills when the 3 siblings reunited. After years of distance, veiled by formal smiles, David, the eldest, wore the seriousness of a judge, a man of rigid principles, marked by the premature responsibility he inherited from watching his father grow old. Julia, the middle child, was like the breeze before the storm, intense, emotional, but guided by a wisdom that sprang from her constant search for understanding and balance. Ethan, the youngest, had in his eyes the restlessness of youth that refuses to mature, but which hid a silent and surprising insight. The passing of the patriarch, Mr. Harold Whitmore, a soft-spoken man with admirable emotional intelligence, severed the loose ties that still bound the family. Everyone believed the will had already been resolved, documented, and filed away, as the decisions of a meticulous man were wont to be. But fate, with its comical and provocative initiative, had other plans. The will was gone like smoke in the wind, and with it, the false piece of blood ties. It was at that moment that hope gave way to insecurity, and thus, the veil was lifted. The disappearance of the will was not just a legal incident. It was an open emotional wound at the heart of the Whitmore family history. The family's former lawyer, a slow-spoken, downcast man named Mr. Bennett, revealed mournfully that the last official document had been removed from the safe weeks before the patriarch's death. Questions hung like heavy clouds. Who removed it? Why? With what intention? The absence of that piece of paper, laden with memories, decisions, and love, was as if the compass had been stolen from a ship at sea. The lack of clear direction brought to the surface unhealed wounds, resentments hidden behind polite gestures. Julia, driven by her affectionate nature, tried to maintain kindness, even while carrying the pain of loneliness inherited from her father's estrangement. Ethan, impatient, saw the situation as an opportunity to prove his worth, or perhaps to reclaim a place he never felt he had. David, for his part, dove into the search for truth like a man on the brink of an abyss, trying to control the chaos with his rigid notion of justice. The absence of the will became more than a mystery. It became a symbol of what had been lost between them. The news that the will was missing spread like wildfire. Neighbors, former employees, and even distant friends began to speculate. Social media was abuzz with cryptic messages and rumors. The patriarch's past, once seen as honorable, began to be questioned. How could such a wise man, so full of compassion and respect, have left such a crucial matter unresolved? It was then that, as happens in great stories of overcoming, each sibling was forced to confront not only the disappearance of the document, but also the internal voids they carried. Ethan delved into old diaries, newspaper clippings, and audio cassettes, trying to decipher his father's essence. Julia searched through saved letters and handwritten recipes for some trace of a hidden desire. And David, obsessed with order, began interrogating everyone involved, trying to piece together a logical timeline that would explain the tragedy. In doing so, they uncovered not only clues about the will, but also painful truths about themselves. Grief drove them, but hope, however fragile, guided them. And when the contents of the will finally came to light, no one was prepared for what would be revealed. Among yellowed papers found hidden inside an old cigar box in the farm's library was a handwritten manuscript signed by Harold Whitmore. It stated that a large portion of the inheritance, including the house where they grew up, the family's land, and a significant portion of their investments, would be donated to a non-profit organization supporting war veterans. Only a small portion was designated directly to the children, something that completely contradicted expectations. David paled, feeling the structure of his life crumble. Julia wept silently, feeling a mixture of understanding and pain. Ethan, shocked, wavered between disbelief and anger. This wasn't just a financial matter. It was as if his father's love had been directed at strangers, as if they had failed. This revelation unleashed an avalanche of emotions: fear, insecurity, anger, and frustration. From that moment on, the will ceased to be a document and became a cruel mirror, a reflection of what each believed they deserved and of what their father, in his silence, believed they needed to learn. The family dynamic, already full of fissures, began to crack. Silence at mealtimes, sidelong glances, and subtle comments became constant. David, accustomed to leading, began to demonstrate even stricter control, trying to bring his siblings together to decide on a plan of action as if they were in a business meeting. Julia, whose empathy had always served as a bridge between them, began to withdraw, hurt by the lack of sincere dialogue. Ethan, with his provocative youth, refused to participate in any conversation that wasn't favorable to him. The atmosphere, previously stifled, became toxic. Every gesture carried a veiled accusation. Past hurts, like the time Julia felt excluded from her father's decisions, or when David was blamed for not caring for his sick mother, emerged with force, demanding space and a voice. The power of kindness which had once inhabited that home seemed a distant memory. Each began to act independently, fueling a spiral of distrust. It was as if, instead of sharing a legacy, they were sharing the burden of hurt. The seeds of discord sprouted quickly, like weeds in fertile soil of resentment. The siblings began exchanging harsh messages followed by long silences. Family gatherings became veiled battles where every word was charged with intent. Julia accused David of manipulating the narrative. David said Ethan was too irresponsible to have an opinion. Ethan, in turn, insinuated that the two elders had always schemed to sideline him. The will became a symbol of all that was left unsaid, of all the hurts ignored. The lack of sincere dialogue demonstrated how a lack of communication and excessive pride can destroy bridges before they're even built. Amidst all this, questions arose that hammered at the minds of all three. Why did our father exclude us? What did we do wrong? Is there still time to fix what was broken? The lack of answers increased the weight of loneliness. But, ironically, it was precisely this shared pain that, if properly understood, could be the beginning of reconciliation. Something neither of them was yet willing to admit, but which was already beginning to creep into the silence between one argument and the next. When emotions boil over, arguments lose their lightness, and what was once conversation turns into confrontation. And that was exactly what happened between the Whitmore brothers. The will, with its moral and legal twist, became fuel for a fire about to devour what remained of their emotional bond. David, driven by a sense of injustice and an almost sacred conviction that his father could not have written that document of his own free will, decided to file a lawsuit to challenge it. Julia hesitated, immersed in a sea of doubt. She wanted the truth, but feared destruction. Ethan, in turn, surprised everyone by taking charge of his own strategy, hiring a lawyer renowned for turning unlikely cases in favor of his clients. The atmosphere, already tense, became suffocating. Each sibling was driven by a different motive. David wanted justice. Julia sought understanding. Ethan, ultimately, wanted to be heard. But they all carried the same pain, the absence of affection. At a time when they most needed unity, the first hearings were like cold duels. Neither of them imagined the emotional cost would be as high as the financial dot. The courtroom became the stage for the Whitmore family's silent tragedy. Each presented evidence, memories, and versions of the story they'd grown up with. The lawyers dug deep into old correspondence, bank records, and diaries hidden in drawers. Witnesses were called, including the house's former housekeeper, a retired gardener, and even a childhood friend of the late patriarch. The sessions were tense, as if each testimony were a nail in the coffin of the siblings' relationship, and deep down, it was. The compassion that used to guide Julia faded with each accusation. David, once a symbol of rationality, began to lose emotional control, exploding into verbal attacks. Ethan, in turn, became increasingly suspicious and isolated. Emotional intelligence was cast aside in the name of wounded pride. And, as in every battle, there were spectators. Distant cousins, friends, curious onlookers, all watching the fall of a family that had once been a symbol of unity. The public exposure was humiliating, and shame began to erode what remained of mutual respect. Amidst it all, a question lingered. How much is it worth fighting for if the price is losing everything that truly matters? Greed has a cost, and it's rarely paid in cash. As the case progressed, the brothers began to notice the cracks in their own souls. Julia lost her appetite and sleep. She felt torn between the need for justice and the pain of seeing her brothers destroy each other. David began to distance himself from his children and wife, obsessed with winning the case, as if that would restore his dignity. Ethan plunged into partying and addiction, trying to numb the fear of being discarded again. Relationships became fragile. Trust, that invisible bridge that sustains every true bond, was in ruins. Humanity crumbled amid clauses and legal arguments. And even with all the sophistication of the process, what was most missing was something that cannot be bought: forgiveness. This battle for inheritance wasn't just about the assets. It was about validation, about remembrance, about the feeling of being seen and loved, and that's not written in any will. With each hearing, it became clearer that the true solution might not lie in court, but it was too early to see that. The pain still spoke louder. However, deep in each person's heart, a silent seed of hope began to sprout. Time, that patient old master, began to work behind the scenes as the storm began to tire. After months of legal battles, crossed glances, and slammed doors, the Whitmore brothers began to face the wreckage of what they once called family. Court sessions had been temporarily suspended due to a pending document, forcing an unplanned and, curiously, necessary pause. It was during this hiatus that the walls of pride began to crack. Julia, always sensitive to the pain of others, decided to begin family therapy, even though she knew her brothers might refuse. To her surprise, Ethan accepted immediately. David, reluctantly, relented after weeks of silence. The initiative came not from a heroic gesture, but from profound exhaustion. It was as if they had exhausted all avenues of accusation, and now, all that remained was the possibility, however uncomfortable, of understanding. There, in their first meetings, amidst harsh words and silences laden with hurt, small sparks of humanity began to emerge. The therapist, a sweet-spoken and firm woman, helped them truly listen. And listening, when there is love and empathy, is the first step to forgiveness. The journey of self-discovery was not easy. Each session exposed fears that for decades had been swept under the rug of convenience. David found himself confronted with his rigidity, realizing that his quest for control was actually a shield against the insecurity of not having been the ideal son. Julia recognized her tendency to mediate everything, even what wasn't hers to do, and understood that her compassion didn't need to nullify her own pain. Ethan, perhaps most surprisingly, uncovered the emptiness that stemmed from the constant search for approval, an absence of affection he always tried to hide behind sarcasm. These discoveries did not come lightly. They involved sleepless nights, turbulent internal dialogues, and intense emotional confrontations. But it was in this process that wisdom began to blossom. David began writing letters to his brothers, trying to express what he'd never had the courage to say out loud. Julia rekindled her passion for chronicles, channeling her pain into inspiring words. Ethan began volunteering at a youth shelter, and there, he saw himself in many of them. Gradually, the brothers discovered that growing up hurts, but maturing is a form of reconciliation with one's past. There was no precise moment, no final point, no now everything is resolved. Forgiveness arrived like the sunrise, slowly, silently, almost imperceptibly. It came in small gestures like the coffee Julia made for David before therapy, or the book Ethan left on Julia's desk, underlined with passages about reconciliation. It also came in the conversations they began having in the late afternoons, unscripted, unpressured. The family, though still fragmented, began to rebuild itself with the building blocks of humility and honesty. It was during one of these conversations that David, for the first time, cried in front of them, admitting that he was afraid. Fear of losing his brothers, fear of having disappointed his father, fear of not being able to fix anything. And it was in that moment, there amidst tears and respectful silences, that Ethan stood, placed his hand on his brother's shoulder, and said, "We still have time." The simple phrase carried the power of kindness. Julia, with teary eyes, added, "And we have each other." That moment didn't erase the past, but it did forge a new path. A path where hope, at last, had a home again. And there was still something important they needed to understand, something that began to emerge between lines, gestures, and shared memories. As the months passed, discussions gave way to comfortable silences, and the noises of the past were gradually replaced by conversations filled with sincerity. What was once a battlefield was now fertile ground, ready to receive new seeds. This time of collaboration and reconciliation. The siblings began to revisit the spaces of the old farm with new eyes. The old barn where they played hide-and-seek became a community reform project, conceived by Ethan, who began leading youth at social risk. Julia, inspired by the family's journey, created a small cultural center in honor of her father, where stories of life, overcoming difficulties, and love would be shared. David, who once only saw the rigidity of the law, now lectured on emotional intelligence and humanized leadership at local universities. Each, in their own way, began to understand that their father's true legacy lay not in material possessions, but in the lessons he left behind, in the silent acts of affection, in the example of perseverance, and in the power of kindness that, even in his mistakes, Harold Whitmore tried to convey. Time proved once again that love, when cultivated, blossoms where least expected. The importance of communication became more evident than ever. During their Sunday get-togethers, now transformed into symbolic dinners, the brothers made a point of maintaining a space for active listening. No cell phones on the table, no shying away from difficult conversations. They spoke of hurts, yes, but with respect and without the need to be right all the time. A new way of relating emerged, with kindness, intelligence, and generosity. They learned to ask, "How are you really?" and to accept silence as a valid answer. David's children began visiting the cultural center frequently. Julia adopted a cat in honor of her father, who always said that the presence of an animal taught him more about empathy than any book. Ethan, for his part, began keeping a journal, not to be read, but to remind himself of who he was, who he had become, and who he could still be. The family dynamic wasn't perfect, but now it was real, honest, and human. And this change began with a choice: choosing to listen, choosing to understand, choosing to forgive, choosing to build a new future, even with the broken pieces of the past. After all, that was what Harold had always wanted, even if he never said it out loud. The lessons learned in this process were more profound than any court ruling or financial inventory could capture. The siblings realized that legacy isn't about what you leave in the world, but about what you plant in others. And this kind of legacy only grows with compassion, courage, initiative, and a generous dose of vulnerability. The Whitmore family became a local example of resilience, not because of their wealth, but because of their ability to reinvent themselves. David, the most skeptical, became an advocate for family mediation. Julia, the most sensitive, became a reference in emotional reconnection projects. Ethan, the rebellious, became a mentor to teenagers who had no one to listen to their stories. And through it all, they learned that even the greatest pain can be transformed into inspiration if welcomed with empathy. In the end, they understood that it wasn't about who would inherit what, but about how each chose to honor their father's memory. An imperfect father, but full of intention. A man who, in his silence, taught that even a lost will can become a map to rediscovering what matters most: humanity, love, and the right to start over. But what if the truth about the will hadn't yet been fully revealed? What began as strangeness and frustration soon became fertile ground for distrust and suspicion. The lack of a clear will, coupled with the unexpected content of the recovered document, created the perfect scenario for accusations to emerge, at first timid, then heated. David insinuated that Ethan might have manipulated the will for his own benefit. Ethan accused David of wanting to control everything, as he always did. Julia, trying to mediate the conflicts, ended up being accused by both of them of bias. What remaining affection crumbled amid unconfirmed assumptions. The silence between the three, once uncomfortable, was now fraught with tension. Words ceased to be bridges and became weapons. Old wounds were reopened. The father's absence at important moments. The unequal division of attention. The veiled comparisons. The lack of understanding turned small differences into vast chasms. With each conversation, a new reason for doubt emerged. With each meeting, another shred of trust was eroded. The atmosphere in the Whitmore family home was becoming tense, almost unbreathable. And at the center of it all was a question no one asked aloud. What did Dad see in each of us? Over time, the disagreements gained witnesses. Lawyers, family friends, and even former employees began to hear differing accounts from the three siblings. The public image of the Whitmore family, once synonymous with prestige and unity, was now a minefield of conflicting versions. David, driven by his sense of justice, began to thoroughly investigate all of his father's financial transactions. Ethan, trying to prove his innocence, made old messages and notes written by the patriarch public, which only increased the tension. Julia, torn between grief and the need to maintain peace, felt increasingly isolated. The empathy between them, which should have been the guiding thread of reconciliation, disappeared between cold emails and brief phone calls. No one trusted anyone. Humanity gave way to coldness, and the feeling of being watched, judged, fueled the cycle of insecurity. Even the happy memories of childhood seemed tarnished. That house, once a refuge, now felt like an emotional tribunal where no one wanted to lose, even if, to do so, they had to destroy each other. The pain was so great that it was no longer clear whether they were fighting for the inheritance or for a validation that the will would never bring. The seeds of discord blossomed into impulsive behavior. Ethan, in a fit of rage, destroyed a piece of historic furniture in the house, accusing David of wanting to erase his history. David, in response, had shared bank accounts frozen. Julia, trying to contain the chaos, began to fall emotionally ill. She cried alone, wrote letters she didn't send, and felt torn between two worlds, that of reason and that of emotion. The key words of childhood, trust, protection, unity, were now distant memories. The will, that simple piece of paper, became a symbol of their lack of love. Resentment made them lose perspective. The most ironic thing? They all wanted, in some way, to honor their father. But they were so immersed in their individual pain that they couldn't see that the only real way to honor him was by rebuilding what they had lost between them, the ability to be brothers. Still, there was something invisible hovering in the air like a last thread of hope. Because deep down, amidst the wreckage, there still remained a spark of wisdom. And perhaps it would take something even greater to awaken it, once and for all. To understand the chaos, it was necessary to delve into each person's motivations and, like an emotional puzzle, realize that behind their actions lay old wounds, clamoring for attention. David had always been the brother who carried the world on his shoulders. After his mother's death, at a young age, he felt it was his responsibility to protect his siblings, take care of the business, and maintain the family honor. His desire for justice stemmed from his insecurity about not being seen, about not having been welcomed as he himself needed. Julia, on the other hand, grew up as the emotional link between them all. Always conciliatory, she often suppressed her own voice to avoid conflict. The will confronted her with the fear of having been irrelevant to her father. Ethan, the more impulsive, always felt like Plan B, the one no one took seriously. His anger was deeply rooted in a lack of recognition. Understanding this emotional structure revealed that, deep down, they all sought the same thing: love. But each did it in their own way, with their own tools, not always effective, not always fair, but human. And even though they were on opposing sides, their pain was more similar than they imagined. This perspective became clearer in a mediation session led by a systemic therapist, who proposed an unusual dynamic. Each sibling was to write a letter as if they were their father, addressed to the other two. At first, there was resistance. David said it was something for psychologists who live in utopia. Ethan found it amusing. Julia just smiled, as if she understands that some battles require different strategies. The exercise, however, surprised them. As they wrote, they were forced to put themselves in the patriarch's shoes. David wrote stiffly, but in the end, he wrote, "I didn't know how to show love. I was better with spreadsheets than with hugs." Julia wrote tenderly, blurting out, "If I could go back, I would have said I love you more often." Ethan, amidst grammatical errors and scribbles, concluded with, "I just wish I'd heard you say you were proud of me." Those simple pieces of paper caused a stir. For the first time, the brothers saw each other as mirrors. Each was simultaneously victim and perpetrator. Each needed the courage to admit that, despite all their differences, there was still room for reconciliation. This emotional revelation didn't erase their conflicts overnight, but it did bring a new perspective. Altruism began to subtly emerge in their daily attitudes. David began to listen more than he spoke. Julia began to set boundaries, even if it meant saying no. Ethan stopped shying away from difficult conversations. They began to plan together how to handle what remained of the inheritance, no longer as enemies, but as parts of the same story. They reminisced about family trips, Christmas nights, their father's scoldings followed by muffled laughter. And there, they realized something powerful. The most valuable inheritance they had received was not written in clauses, but engraved in their memories, in their way of speaking, in their inherited facial features. Emotional intelligence was finally taking center stage. Collaboration, previously unlikely, now became possible. And as a prelude to healing, a silent pact was made between them. Even if they would not forget the past, They would not allow it to determine the future. After all, there was still something greater to be discovered, something that would put everything into perspective. Even with the small signs of rapprochement, the legal system continued its cold and relentless march. The judge in charge, experienced and discreet, had ruled that the evidence presented by David should be re-evaluated, reigniting the tension between the brothers. Hearings were scheduled, documents reviewed, witnesses recalled. Each session seemed like a distorted mirror of reality. There, the brothers were no longer grieving children trying to understand each other, but opposing sides in a dispute that consumed their energy, time, and sanity. The lawyers, though experienced, seemed more interested in winning than in reconciliation. Julia, emotionally exhausted, broke down in tears before the judge as she recalled her last moments with her father. David and Ethan, even trying to maintain their composure, felt the weight of the exposure. The technical questions, the legal terms, the dates, the signatures, everything that should have clarified the matter, only drove them further apart. It was a spectacle where no one applauded. And deep down, everyone knew the price of greed was already being paid, even if the verdict hadn't yet been handed down. The family, once solid, now swayed like a rusty bridge under the weight of a lack of compassion. Behind the scenes, pain piled up like unopened letters. David's wife threatened to leave him if he didn't back down. Julia began to experience recurring anxiety attacks. Ethan, trying to maintain an image of control, spent sleepless nights reviewing legal clauses as if he were studying for his life. Friends began to drift away, uncomfortable with the dense energy surrounding them. The Whitmore name, once synonymous with respect, was whispered in city cafes with pity or contempt. It was the cost of exposure, pride, and a lack of emotional intelligence. Yet, something unexpected began to happen. In the midst of this whirlwind, Julia had a conversation with Ethan's lawyer, a young and surprisingly sensible man, that made her reflect. The real victory may not be in court, but in what you'll be able to rebuild after this, he said, almost as if planting an idea that might blossom. And so, little by little, each brother began to ask himself, what would remain if they kept fighting? Until the end? Were they truly seeking justice, or just trying to avenge unresolved feelings from the past? It was when the final hearing was scheduled that reality hit hard. The judge demanded that the brothers appear together, in person, and not represented by lawyers. In that room, face to face, without filters, without rhetoric, David, Julia, and Ethan looked at each other for long seconds. For the first time in months, there were no witnesses, no journalists, no lawyers. Just them and the truth. The judge began the session with an unexpected speech about humanity, citing previous cases in which families had been destroyed for less. And then, he proposed a week-long recess for the brothers to seek a consensual solution. A rare chance, a ray of hope. They left in silence, but something had changed. Julia held the door for David. Ethan pressed the elevator button for the three of them. Small gestures, invisible to hurried eyes, but which carried the promise of something greater. The desire, however timid, to find a way out that would not involve further pain. After all, the real drama lay not in the court records, but in the unspoken pages of their life stories. As they drove home after that final hearing, the three siblings felt for the first time the true impact of what they had become. The silence in the car was more deafening than any previous argument. Julia's face reflected profound exhaustion. Her dark circles revealed sleepless nights and the heavy heart of someone who had loved too much and been listened to too little. David, always so methodical, now had the expression of someone who had lost control of their own narrative. And Ethan, though more serene, held in his eyes a sadness that only someone denied love from an early age can hide for so long. Their childhood home, once a refuge and symbol of unity, now seemed nothing more than a monument of corroded memories. Photos on the walls that once bore genuine smiles now seemed to mock everything they had become. The cost of greed wasn't just legal, it was emotional, it was spiritual. It was missed birthdays, avoided hugs, swallowed apologies. That battle had left them financially unstable, emotionally broken, and socially isolated. And in that moment, they understood what many never do. Not every gain compensates for the loss of what truly sustains life. Amidst so much chaos, an unexpected invitation came. The NGO benefiting from the will would organize an event in honor of the patriarch, thanks to his donation. The three were invited. At first, they declined. But something about it, perhaps. The idea of hearing how their father had impacted other people's lives touched them. They decided to go. And there, among war veterans, grateful families, and moving stories, they discovered a new dimension of their father that they had never known. A man who, even in silence, had consistently practiced altruism. A man who understood that the power of kindness is often invisible. Hearing those stories was like immersing himself in a new will, not one that divided assets, but one that revealed character. At the end of the event, a blind woman approached them and said, "Your father taught me that generosity isn't about giving what's left over. It's about sharing what you are." That sentence broke something inside them. For the first time in a long time, David cried unashamedly. Ethan held his hand. Julia smiled with her eyes. And in that instant, the weight began to dissolve. The true cost of greed was then understood. They had distanced themselves from who they were. They had exchanged their emotional inheritance for legal clauses. They had let fear decide for them. And now, faced with that acknowledged pain, they felt the call of reconciliation as a new chance. What could they still save? Over time, they returned to therapy. They remade agreements, this time not legal, but emotional. They decided together to transform part of the remaining inheritance into a fund to support the NGO, not out of obligation, but by choice. Ethan resumed his studies. Julia began writing a book about the family history. David finally accepted that vulnerability is a form of courage. Each step was an exercise in resilience, perseverance, and rebuilding. The path was not easy, but now it was walked with consciousness. After all, they had learned it the hard way that a family's most precious asset isn't measured in dollars, but in gestures, words, memories, and above all, in the courage to start over. Time, always time, healed the wounds opened by the battle. Not by erasing them, but by allowing them to heal with dignity. Months later, the brothers decided to organize a symbolic ceremony in the garden of their childhood home. They planted a tree there, an oak tree. Strong, resilient, with deep roots. Each one threw a handful of soil. Julia read an excerpt from her book. Ethan played a song their father liked. David gave a speech simple, sincere. And there, around that small sapling, they made a new pact. Not to forget what had happened, but to remember it in a healthy way. So that pain would no longer guide their steps, but rather serve as a constant reminder that life is too fragile to be wasted on pride. They decided to keep the house as a space of memory and learning. A place where other families could be welcomed, heard, and guided in times of crisis. What had once nearly destroyed them would now be a tool for rebuilding. Because what they learned about empathy, honesty, emotional intelligence, and love was no longer confined to themselves. It needed to be shared with the world. As time passed, the Whitmore story took on a life beyond the city walls. The social project grew. Julia's book became a reference in therapeutic circles, and the family story became an inspiration at conferences on mediation and restorative justice. Each sibling found their place in the world, not as heirs to a fortune, but as guardians of a profound lesson. Their father's legacy, once seen as a source of division, was now a symbol of unity. A reminder that it is possible to lose oneself and still find oneself again. That it is possible to make mistakes and still deserve forgiveness. That it is possible to fail and still be worthy of love. Their story began to be told by others, adapted into plays, and cited in lectures. But the most important thing wasn't the external applause. It was in the simple Sunday gatherings, the recovered inside jokes, the retaken photos. His daily life was filled with kindness and affection. And not even time could erase that thought finally. Each of them understood that their father's true testament was not made of words on paper, but of repeated actions, of values taught in silence, of mistakes that required humility to acknowledge. They learned together that true wealth lies in how we choose to love even when it's difficult. That the greatest innovation a family can experience is learning to talk. That the greatest legacy is the ability to begin again every day with a little more wisdom. And that, even in the most painful stories, there will always be room for inspiration. The patriarch is gone, but he left roots. And those roots have blossomed not in bank accounts, but in touched hearts. The Whitmore story is, ultimately, a living reminder that every conflict holds within itself the seed of healing. All it takes is the courage to face it head on, and the will to build together. Because the will that really matters is the one you write every day, between the lines of life. And now tell me, how many invisible legacies do you carry without even realizing it? How many unresolved hurts are there, hidden behind forced smiles or prolonged silences? The story of the Whitmore family may seem like a distant drama, but the truth is that it speaks to something much closer: our relationships, our silences, our lost opportunities. Are you also expecting too much from those who don't know how to show love? Are you struggling to be right while slowly losing people who matter? How many important conversations have you been putting off? How many apologies have you yet to make? And most importantly, what will remain when there's no more time? If this story has touched you in any way, then perhaps it's time to stop repeating the same patterns and start building bridges with more empathy, with more emotional intelligence, with more initiative. This is the time to choose reconciliation over pride. And if you want to continue learning how to transform conflict into connection, heal family wounds, and write your own legacy with wisdom, then subscribe to the channel now. Activate the bell, and come with us on this journey. Because life is too short to put off love for later.